Before the world decided to tear itself apart, my battles were fought with ink and deadlines on the south side of Chicago. I chronicled the quiet desperation and the loud corruption of a city that never slept. My weapon was a royal typewriter, my armor a press pass, and a healthy dose of cynicism. I believed in the story. I believed if you could just get the words right, if you could frame the truth perfectly, you could make people see. Then came the uniform, the rifle, and a long, sickening boat ride to a place that smelled of salt, citrus, and old stone. Italy, my new dateline. They made me a scout for the 3rd Infantry Division. It made a certain kind of sense. A journalist's job is to see what others miss, to go where the story is, to analyze the facts on the ground. A scout does the same, only the stakes are a hell of a lot higher than a competitor scooping your byline. Here, the headline could be your own obituary. My editors were now lieutenants with worry etched into their faces, and my paragraphs were terse reports whispered over a crackling radio. September 1943, Salerno. The word itself felt hot and dusty in my mouth. Operation Avalanche. We were the tip of a very long, very sharp spear aimed at the gut of Europe. From the landing craft, the beach looked deceptively peaceful, a postcard crescent of sand against the azure Mediterranean. But the moment the ramp dropped, the postcard tore itself to shreds. The air became a physical thing, a churning storm of sound and steel. The symphony of the damned, the high-pitched shriek of incoming shells, the rhythmic, gut-thumping cough of the heavy machine guns, and the wet, desperate cries of men who had been whole seconds before. We scrambled ashore, heads down, each man a universe of fear and resolve, trying to cross that strip of sand that felt 1,000 miles wide. We clawed our way off the beach, into the tangled hills and ancient olive groves that rose up like a wall. My job was to move ahead of the main push, find them before they find us, read the terrain, write the story of what was waiting in the next fold of the earth. I moved with a ghost's tread, my M1 Garand feeling heavy and foreign in my hands. I was always more comfortable with a pen. With me was Corporal Miller, a farm boy from Iowa whose silence was more profound than any poem I'd ever read. We were a two-man truth-finding mission. The heat was a physical presence pressing down, shimmering off the rocks. The air was thick with the scent of wild thyme and cordite. Every snap of a twig was a gunshot. Every shadow held a German patrol. My mind, a creature of habit, began composing the lead. Salerno, Italy, under a punishing Italian sun. American forces pushed inland today against stiff resistance. The landscape itself, a formidable foe asterisk, it was a defense mechanism, a way to build a wall of words between me and the raw, screaming reality of it. To observe, not to feel. My greatest fear wasn't a bullet, it was that this wall would become permanent, that I'd see so much I'd eventually see nothing at all, that I would lose the one thing a writer cannot survive without: empathy. We were moving along a low ridge, maybe a mile ahead of our company. Below us, a narrow road snaked through a valley, a perfect artery for our tanks and trucks to push through once the area was secured. The silence was heavy, unnatural. The cicadas had stopped their song. That was the first clue. A journalist learns to listen to the silence. It often tells you more than the noise. Miller caught my eye, and I saw the same question in his. He pointed toward a dense cluster of olive trees and a crumbling stone farmhouse on the reverse slope of the next hill. It looked peaceful, idyllic even. The kind of place you'd see on a travel poster, but something was wrong. I raised my binoculars, the metal hot against my skin. I swept the scene, my eyes doing what they'd been trained to do for years: find the detail that doesn't fit, the broken tile on the roof, the cart with a broken wheel. Then I saw it, a faint track in the dust leading into the olive grove too wide for a farm cart. A patch of earth near the farmhouse that was a slightly different color, disturbed, and a flicker of movement, not a bird, not a lizard. It was the flat, dull green of a German helmet, visible for a fraction of a second before it disappeared behind a gnarled olive trunk. My breath caught in my throat like a shard of ice. I lowered the binoculars, my heart hammering against my ribs. Miller looked at me, his face pale beneath the grime. "Art," he whispered. "Stay here," I breathed, my voice tight. "Cover me." I slid down from the ridge, using the scrub and rock for cover, my body low to the ground. The cynicism I wore like a coat was gone, burned away by a flood of pure, cold adrenaline. This was no longer an observation. This was the story. I crawled on my belly for what felt like an eternity, the sharp stones and dry earth scraping my skin. The smell of the soil was rich and ancient. I could feel the history in it, the ghosts of Roman legions and Norman knights, and now us, adding our own ghosts to the collection. I found a position behind a low stone wall that gave me a clear, if terrifying, view. And the full picture slammed into me. It wasn't just a patrol, it was a perfectly concealed artillery position. Two of them, 88s, the legendary 88s, the boogeyman of every GI in this war. They were dug in, camouflaged with netting and olive branches, their long barrels aimed directly at the valley road below. They were waiting. They were waiting for our boys, for the Shermans and the half-tracks to roll into that narrow valley, thinking it was clear. It wasn't an ambush, it was a slaughterhouse in waiting. I could see the crews, men in dusty feldgrau moving with quiet efficiency. One of them was smoking a cigarette, leaning against the gun's breech, looking bored. Another was wiping his face with a rag. They were just men waiting to kill my friends. The banality of it was the most shocking part. They weren't monsters, they were soldiers doing their job. And in that moment, seeing them so clearly, my fear of becoming numb felt terrifyingly real. Because to save my men, I had to stop seeing those Germans as men at all. I had to see them as a problem to be solved, a target. My mind went into overdrive. The writer, the analyst, took over. I pulled the notepad and the charcoal nub from my pack. My hands were shaking, but my mind was a block of ice. I began to sketch. This wasn't a creative act. It was a transcription of death. I drew the farmhouse, the ridge, the road. I marked the exact position of the guns. I noted the stone wall that would provide them cover from one direction, the dead ground to their west. I drew their likely fields of fire, a deadly overlapping fan that would leave nothing in the valley alive. I estimated the range. I noted the ammunition crates stacked neatly nearby. I was writing the most important story of my life, not with words, but with lines and angles and numbers. A clinical, detached report on a massacre waiting to happen. I spent 20 minutes there, my cheek pressed to the warm Italian earth, my world narrowed to that notepad and the scene of methodical death across the way. Every detail I captured felt like another nail in their coffins. And with every line I drew, I felt a piece of myself chip away. The empathetic observer was being shoved aside by the cold tactician. To bear witness, I had to become an instrument of the violence itself. Getting back was worse. Every rustle of leaves was the sound of my discovery. I rejoined Miller, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. I didn't say much, I just tapped the notepad. We have to go, now. We ran. We scrambled and slid down ravines, crawled through thorny brush, our lungs burning, our legs screaming. It wasn't a retreat, it was a race against time. A race against the lead elements of our own division walking blindly into that trap. We found Lieutenant Cross about half a mile back, his command group huddled around a map spread on a jeep's hood. He was a good officer, a former history teacher who understood the weight of the ground we fought on. I stumbled toward him, gasping for air, and thrust the sweat-stained pages of my notepad into his hand. Sir, artillery, 288s, hidden position, coordinates on the sketch. They're zeroed in on the valley road. He looked at me, then at the detailed drawings, his eyes, usually tired, sharpened with focus. He traced the lines with his finger, his lips moving silently. He saw the analysis, the fields of fire, the vulnerabilities I'd noted. He looked up from my crude map, not at me, but through me. For a second, I wasn't Private Sterling. I was just the source of a credible report. Get the radio, he barked to his sergeant. I need a fire mission, now. He rattled off the coordinates, the description of the target, the urgency in his voice cutting through the humid air like a knife. And then we waited. It was only a few minutes, but it stretched into an eon. I sat with my back against a tree, the adrenaline draining out of me, leaving a hollow, trembling void. I had filed my story. Now it was up to the editors at headquarters to run it. First came the whisper, a sound like tearing silk high overhead, then another and another. It was our own artillery answering my call. A few seconds later, the world across the ridge erupted. The ground shook. A series of deep, concussive booms rolled over us, a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the bones. Plumes of black smoke and brown earth climbed into the blue sky, obscuring the sun. The barrage was merciless, systematic. They weren't just firing at the guns, they were erasing that entire patch of ground from existence. I didn't watch. I just stared at my own hands, still smudged with charcoal and dirt. These hands, which had once typed stories about zoning laws in council meetings, had just pointed the finger of God at a dozen men I had seen smoking cigarettes and wiping sweat from their brows. I didn't pull a trigger, but they were dead because of me, because of my words, because of my map. The line between bearing witness and participating had vanished. It was a story written in fire and steel, and the byline was mine. The shelling stopped. The silence that fell in its wake was more profound, more deafening than the noise it replaced. It was a dead silence. Lieutenant Cross walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. You saved the whole damn company, Sterling. Maybe the battalion. I looked up at him, but I couldn't find any words. There was no pride, no relief, just a vast, echoing emptiness. I had done my duty. I had used my skills to save my friends. But in doing so, I had faced my greatest fear. To make that report to be that effective, I had to turn off the part of me that saw a man smoking a cigarette and see only a target. I had to become numb, if only for an hour. And I was terrified that one day I wouldn't be able to turn it back on. The journalist in me knew this was the real story, not the battle, not the victory, but the cost. The price of looking into the abyss and using its own cold logic against it. That day, on a hill in Italy, I learned that the most powerful words aren't always printed. Sometimes they are just coordinates on a map, a quiet sentence that unleashes a storm, and you have to live with the silence that comes after. These memories are heavy, but they must be shared. Subscribe to ensure these stories are never forgotten.